Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Celona Field Journal, where we bring you practical information on private 5G. Today, we're talking enterprise policy enforcement with a 5G LAN. And to talk with us here today, we have a security expert, Jennifer Manila. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Hey, Andrew.
So this is an ongoing series that we've had with you on security and 5G. Today, we're talking enterprise policy enforcement. And let's start off with this one, Jennifer. What enterprise integration benefits does a 5G LAN offer that is absent from a public 5G network or a private 5G network built by a carrier or an MNO?
Okay, well, that's a good question, and I think it's probably the answer is probably pretty straightforward here. And if anybody has looked at architecture drawings for networks, this is going to be you're going to understand this pretty easily. Obviously, if the network is fully managed by a third party, whether it's a carrier or somebody else, any network, frankly, there's going to be some limitations to how it's integrated into your LAN or whatever your LAN looks like, or your WAN or network infrastructure. And that's for a few reasons, because, they want to retain control over the environment. They want to make sure they've got the right, connectivity and bandwidth and power and et cetera. So sometimes they tighten the screws pretty tightly on whoever they are managing something in your environment, right? They start to put boxes around it. And so especially if that part of that infrastructure, like the packet core, which is processing all of that, is off somewhere else, the opportunity for integrating it back into the LAN, it's not impossible, but it becomes more limited. And then, of course, you've got some exposure concerns with attaching to something out into somebody else's cloud, and that requires some level of expertise and resources that know how to do that securely. So you contrast that with something that is dropping, straight into the infrastructure. And I know, like Celona, with what you guys do, there's opportunity to I don't remember what you call it, but we can effectively sort of bridge the traffic between the two. We can route traffic between them, or we can NAT, which is very similar in my mind to what we can do with most of the enterprise Wi-Fi products, whether it's a controller or cloud managed type of thing with a management platform. So we've effectively then opened up the opportunity to manage the 5G LAN or private cellular network the same way we're managing it with the Wi-Fi network and the rest of the infrastructure, which is pretty cool.
So essentially, with a Celona type private 5G solution, we're just an extension of the existing enterprise network. Whereas with a carrier or an MNO, it's essentially a parallel network that has to get back into the enterprise through some other application architecture choices and approaches that have to be implemented, like potentially a VPN back into your environment or some other way to get back in, because you're not natively just an extension of the network.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously that gets to be a little bit, whether we're talking private cellular or anything, especially with network routing over that type of connection, that any routing architect out there knows that gets a little bit murky and a little challenging to manage long term. It takes a lot of care and feeding.
And it's a lot of additional effort and time spent by enterprise IT and application development teams to understand and re-architect potentially their applications, because maybe they have it running today on their wired Ethernet or their Wi-Fi network, and they're looking to move it to private 5G. If they're implementing an application that is for their business processes, and it looks to be on their network the same as they already had it for the way that they had done it, there's very little application architectural change. There's very little security enforcement change on their network with, let's say, security systems they have in place with firewalls, IPS, IDS on their network, web application security gateways, things of that nature. Whereas if they move it onto a separate parallel network, they have to completely re-architect the application to work in that environment. That takes a lot of time and effort. And then they have to support potentially two different ways of that application operating.
Yep, absolutely. And then even just more simpler than that, I've seen some providers that require even a separate internet link, right? They want to separate everything. They want separate switches or connectivity. They want separate ISP links or WAN links out. So yeah, it absolutely, even if you don't have to deal with the application stuff, there's a lot of just complexity at layer 2 and layer 3.
Well, and one thing that, that kind of just resonated for me that I just, realized is that enterprises have a lot of downstream operational impact from that as well, of support teams and how do they troubleshoot. What's their mean time to resolution if they have an issue, whether it's in their network and they have control over that, versus if it's under somebody else's control and they have to call a third party to get support on the line and have a contract in place for a certain response time, and that can be a hassle in and of itself as well.
Exactly. And I'm going to be very honest with you in saying, and my experience so far, and obviously this is emerging technology and use cases, but so far, a lot of the organizations that are managing this, that come especially from the carrier side, they don't have the enterprise IT expertise, right? They specialize in cellular. And so when we start talking about, applications and the types of data that we have and users and use cases on the enterprise, that's very foreign to them. And so troubleshooting in that model becomes exponentially more challenging.
For sure. So maybe let's, pivot a little bit to talk about security. And so how does direct integration of 5G, or private 5G with an enterprise network, how does that impact an organization's security strategy, or how does it affect their strategy compared to, let's say, a public mobile network or a private network that is deployed in parallel and separate from the enterprise network?
I think there's probably three things there. So one being visibility, two being centralized paper policy, and three being a centralized technical control policy. So, from a visibility standpoint, it would be kind of like if you have a house and then let's say you have a vacation house somewhere else. Now you've got to sort of monitor and secure both of those separately, right? Because they're not co-located. And it's the same thing when we talk about network infrastructure. So if you have this network infrastructure here and the other one running in parallel, even if it's physically geolocated in the same place, logically those data paths are different. And then, there could be different other entities in that traffic path that makes it a little bit more challenging. So from the visibility standpoint, then we get into paper policy. So, a lot of policies within an organization and within compliance requirements, talk about wireless, but they're really talking about Wi-Fi specifically. There's definitely opportunity, and I've helped some organizations rewrite some of their policies to make it a little bit more broad so that we can actually address something like private cellular in the same policy statement as we have Wi-Fi. So we're talking about, authentication and encryption strengths and et cetera, which is pretty cool because that's obviously less to maintain and less to deal with. And from a, compliance audit perspective, whether it's PCI or HIPAA or something else, it's just easy to check those boxes. So then you get into the controls aspect of it, which is we have a policy that states something. How are we actually monitoring or controlling that? And now we're talking about, with a fully integrated solution, you can do things. I'm going to use Celona as an example since that's where we are. But I know, you guys you kind of like egress the cellular traffic and put it onto the LAN. We talked about before, ability to do sort of what I call bridge route or NAT. And then, like map that over to a VLAN and have an entity within the wired infrastructure then that can be traced back to that cellular entity on the network. So it looks and feels and behaves and can be controlled the same as Wi-Fi or wired traffic at that point, which is pretty cool. So again, segmentation, maybe, future looking, we can do things like, centralized radius policies for things like this, for authorization. So we can, continue to add and layer and treat those controls policies and the mechanisms we're actually using the same as we would Wi-Fi, which is frankly, that's amazing. And you've effectively reduced your work by half at that point.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So we know that traditional or enterprise networks have security gaps that they're always trying to minimize or close if possible. Um, is there any way that a 5G LAN or a private 5G network can address some of those security gaps that may exist within wired and Wi-Fi networks that an enterprise has today? Do we know what those gaps are and what potentially how 5G could help?
I think there's a long list. I'm going to maybe just call out one that I think is critical, which is just the identification of the endpoint or device or user, whatever we're looking at. And I know in another session we've kind of talked about the benefit of and the differences is profiling and identity and assertion of an identity with something like a MAC address. So just knowing what's on the network. Any security professional, any CISO is going to tell you the number one challenge and gap they have in traditional enterprise IT as well as operational technology networks. That first gap is that visibility, especially with the asset inventory of the endpoints and users. Huge gap. That's something we can easily address here.
Interesting. So we can understand what's on our network, and then it's kind of half the battle is done for you to understand what it should be doing on the network at that point.
Exactly. Yep. Everything else follows the visibility.
Perfect. So what are the security implications of deploying a private 5G solution yourself versus sourcing and maybe integrating each network function individually? So kind of one of our mantras at Celona is kind of a turnkey 5G solution of you're getting the complete end-to-end infrastructure solution from one source rather than buying a radio and a packet core and authentication database and various functions and pieces, subscriber management, and stitching them all together yourself. So are there any security implications of kind of deploying a turnkey solution versus kind of building your own and integrating all those functions together yourself?
There, sorry, I'm laughing because I didn't even realize people did that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first big one is, when we talk about security, a lot of my answers come back to people. And the enterprise IT teams aren't cellular professionals, and for the most part, they don't want to be. The number one thing when I talk to organizations about private cellular, a lot of the pushback at the executive level is, as soon as the C word comes out, it's like, no, we don't touch that. and they're scared. And so the people thing of that expertise and when you look a lot of the reports and workforce studies and security, all of the different surveys and things, the biggest gap that we have, whether it's cloud security or API and application security, AppSec, whatever, network security, is a knowledge gap with the people that are deploying it. And even if you don't have a knowledge gap in the enterprise IT space, we always have a time issue, right? Like we're already working 60, 80 hours a week. We don't have time to go learn something new and make sure we've dotted every I and crossed every T on an infrastructure like that. So, building and managing parallel infrastructures in an organization like that, unless they came from that space and they have that expertise and they can do it blindfolded, that absolutely would not make sense to me, because then everything else trickles down from that, right?
I mean, maybe here at Celona we can convince the hearts and minds of these enterprise IT admins that they can do cellular and that they don't have to be experts to do it, rather than piecemealing a solution together and having to dive deep into the weeds of everything. They can deploy something that meets their needs a little bit more simply. So maybe we'll round out the enterprise policy kind of conversation with one last question. Enterprise security is often referred to as an ongoing process, not a feature. So it's not a one and done. You've implemented security, wipe your hands, I'm done with it until next time, right? What are enterprises looking for in a private 5G solution to kind of enable that effective ongoing security as an operational aspect for the life of the network?
Oh, I think the ability, and tell me if I'm not answering what you wanted here, but I think the ability to have something you can integrate with the existing infrastructure in a way that you already understand and that can mature along with that in parallel. Because, as I just said, the cellular technology that's out right now is on par with the latest WPA3 Wi-Fi standard that most people haven't implemented yet. And so you're talking about sort of just this parallel movement forward. I'm using that as one example, but the robustness of what these systems can do, because this is still very new, right? I mean, in the US, the spectrum hasn't been open that long. It's sort of just trickling throughout the rest of the world. And there's going to be a lot of change, because it's never a one and done, because even if you have a product that's not changing or technology that's not changing, your security requirements are changing. I just finished getting through CMMC, which is the new audited version of, or the level we were doing is audited version of what you have to do as a federal contractor with CUI. And just as got through the last version of one, version 2 came out and was 4 times the length of version 1 for the same tier. So stuff is always going to be changing. It's never set and forget. That's not specific to cellular. That's all of IT and all of security. And to be able to sort of grow those infrastructures together, and have them integrated and manage that and monitor it and increase and bolster the security incrementally as you go along, I think fits very well into an enterprise strategy.
So getting back to our previous point about potentially reducing the additional effort to not only stand up a private cellular network, but then ongoing operationally from a security perspective to audit it, to improve your security controls. And you can do that in parallel, potentially with the same systems that you're using for the rest of your network, rather than as a separate effort on an ongoing basis to mature security of the cellular. And if it's a whole separate parallel network, you're doing additional rework of all of that effort, rather than when they're integrated. Maybe you can simplify that and condense down to some streamlined effort and operations.
Yeah, and I'm going to argue from the security standpoint that if you have a separate infrastructure for private cellular, let's say you outsourced it, it's managed by a carrier, third party somewhere. There are certain aspects of that your enterprise IT team are duplicating, but then there's pieces of that completely falls off from the security standpoint, right? Your SOC can't see that because everything's encrypted back to that core. So, which you don't manage and don't have visibility into. And so there's this other aspect when you start to run something in parallel separately, where there's use cases for that. Okay, I'm like, there's definitely times that makes sense. But for most enterprise use cases where this is a part of or an extension of an existing network infrastructure and security program, it becomes very challenging, and you're going to lose that visibility. You're going to have to just trust somebody else, and then you're going to have to verify that somebody else is doing what they're saying that they're doing, which I don't know how everybody else feels about that, but my work is an advisory CISO and working with CISOs, validating stuff internally that we're meeting controls, and reporting on that is much simpler than asking a third party to do that. If you can even ask them to do that, that might not even be in the scope of contract, or they may charge you some stupid amount of money to give you those reports. So yes, there's a duplication of some work, and then there's just some level of security visibility you will not have.
Okay, very interesting. So not only just operationally the effort, but potentially expanding the scope if it's not an integrated part of your network. Very interesting. Well, thank you, Jennifer, for being here with us today to talk enterprise policy enforcement on a private 5G network. For additional security content related to 5G, please check out our YouTube channel. We have additional videos with Jennifer talking about security and security aspects of a 5G network. And if you'd like to start your journey learning about 5G, please visit our website at celona.io/journey. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Field Journal. Thank you for joining us today.